Hey, and welcome to another episode of Creative Leaders Unplugged. I'm Morgan here with Arna, and today we talk to Andy Polaine, a service designer, creative leadership expert, author, podcaster, video game creator. What other
Yeah,
titles does he have?
yeah, yeah.
Mentor, coach.
Lots of lots of things. Coach. Yeah. So I realized you these was just two old men, sorry. you know, reminiscing and talking away, and there's so many kind of parallel kind of experiences we had, and so you didn't get a word in. I think you didn't get a word in.
I didn't get so many words in. It did have, but it was a bit more of the style of, okay, these are two people who clearly have the experience, who clearly are resonating with each other and understanding what's happening. And because I don't have as much experience per se, not necessarily in terms of like knowledge, but just I haven't spent as much time in that realm. I didn't have as much that I could, of course, all interesting and fascinating and insightful, but for me, it was harder to say, oh, yeah, okay, well, I have this interesting bit to add here. So,
Yeah, it's because, and I kind of felt that there's a lot of inside information, sort of, because we are sort of part of this, we have been part of the same community of people in
yeah.
the same, that speaks a specific language and
Mhm.
went through a specific evolution. And so, which to me, so I could have gone on for many more hours, because it really helped me, this conversation.
Good.
You
Yeah.
also just kind of because I haven't talked to any in years.
Mm.
So basically, did he end up in the same place as I am now? Right. So we kind of we talked years ago. We were
Mhm.
way more in a sort of a smaller community, part of a smaller community that kind of knew each other. Then we kind of drifted apart.
Mhm.
I haven't really followed his work or his conversations that much. And then now we kind of connected back and started sharing our kind of, what's up now, and where did you go and what did you learn and what is your conclusion after all these years,
Yeah.
where we are now. And it's so fascinating that we ended up in a very similar place. It was like,
Yeah.
so, so yeah, that was
And I can
cool.
imagine there must be like, and that's what the thing that he talked about at the end is these stories he's finding among people, and it's being able to recognize, hey, you're not alone, or hey, I had that the same exact experience.
Yeah.
So to have to run into somebody too that has the same of, it's a really confer like affirming and energizing thing also for me, um to have that recognition and realization. So
Yeah. So that was important. I'm really interested in the book he's writing.
mhm.
There is and go visit him on LinkedIn,
Yeah,
obviously, and become part of the what he calls the early draft community of his
yeah.
book. And the topic is around navigating the leadership dip. I think that's I
And there
don't
was
know.
yeah,
I
I was
think
gonna say there's one point where he talked about like the Pixar process of directing a film. And that at one point that they bring in all of this big group of people to help the director sort it out, right?
yeah,
And that to me was really because of course I'm not yet in that the point. So he writes a book, he's writing a book about a specific demographic, and I'm not yet in that demographic because it's more time related. And so to me, to know that it's already part of the process is also, oh, okay, when this starts to happen to me, I know that it's part of the process. It's not just me having an existential
exactly. Yeah,
crisis.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's all okay. It's supposed to have the dip.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's very
exactly.
true. Go and visit Polain.com. So it's
Mhm.
POLAINE.com. And you can read all about it. So, yeah, enjoy
Yeah.
the conversation.
I'm Andy Polaine, and I live now I live in Germany. And the question that often happens first is, where are you from? And that's always a difficult one. So, I'm English, as people can probably hear. I lived quite a long time in Australia, twice actually, And I live in Germany. I lived a long time in Germany as well. My wife's German. So I'm English Australian or British Australian these days. And we'll see if I get the German one as well. And so, where you're from is a kind of really difficult question for me, because I haven't. I'm coming out. I think in a couple of years' time, I will have lived longer outside of the UK than in, and I've certainly lived, more of my adult life outside of the UK. And in terms of kind of what do I do or who am I? I say I'm a design leadership coach, and sometimes to lay people, I will just say I'm a leadership coach for people in design. That's kind of easier because I think people who might not understand what's the difference between design leadership and something else. And then, secondly, I guess now I'm an educator and writer and podcaster too. But, mostly those are the four things I do.
Well, so it's interesting because that tells me kind of where you're from or not. It tells me what you do, but it actually doesn't answer the question.
No, it doesn't.
Who are you?
That's such a good question. That's the kind of thing I ask my coachees, and we spend many, many sessions looking at.
I'll give you a few seconds. That's all you got.
So I'm a bit of a hybrid. I mean, really, but it's again, I think it's easier to explain. In fact, it is what I get my coaches to do, is just look back over your life, and because you are the sum of those years, 52 in my case, and I, for a very long time, and part of me still actually doesn't really think of myself as a designer. I actually went to film school because I wanted to be a film director, and prior to that, I had, when I was less than 10, when I was a young kid, I really wanted to do visual effects for films, and I was recently looking on Disney Plus. There's a whole documentary about Industrial Light and Magic, which is the visual effects company that George Lucas set up to start to do the visual effects for Star Wars. And that was it for me. That was the moment where I thought, I really want to do this. And I followed that quite a long way, actually. And then decided, no, actually, I think I'd quite like to make films. And so that's where I went to uni. And there I studied film, video, photography, and this new thing called digital media. And so, this was the days of Photoshop 2. It was certainly a year or two before Macromind Director came out and stuff like that. And I got kind of fascinated and kind of distracted by computers. I'd always kind of messed around with computers before. But this idea that I could bring all this stuff with multimedia, I could bring all this stuff together. And so I've always been interested in those kind of crossovers of disciplines. And that's what led me into what became interaction design back then. I'm talking like 90, when I graduated, 93, 94. 93, I think. Back then it didn't have a name. We were just sort of, we called ourselves interactive designers, which no one understood. And I've spent the rest of my career doing things that I've had to explain.
And you still do.
I still do, yeah. And so, I segued into that sort of what became interaction design, and by that time I became, a self-named actually interactive director, because I felt I was working on a lot of projects, but then the sort of web happened. I don't know, it's kind of hard for people to imagine it wasn't there, but I remember the very first browsers and the very first kind of conversations we had about this idea of hypertext and what it meant for nonlinear storytelling and all those kinds of things that we were pretty interested in, and exploring it. And, everyone was finding their way, and it was kind of interesting. And then the sort of dot-com boom started to happen. And I'm seeing kind of echoes of it now. But anyway, we can talk about that later. I saw that there was often art directors or creative directors on projects and technical directors, but there was no one really looking after the experience. Right? And so that's what was my job. And then, I moved around. I was sometimes a creative producer. That was a thing, which I think would be a sort of product person now, product manager now. And did a lot of that stuff. And then my segue into, I'd always done a lot of teaching. So I really consider myself a teacher and a designer now, I guess. I'd always done a lot of teaching, even when I was a student, teaching my other classmates, and then straight afterwards. And I'd set up, a group of us set up a a small collective that was sort of doing a mixture of commercial work and non-commercial work called Anti-Rom back in 93, 94. And it started off as a sort of arts collective making these little interactive experiments. And then companies like Levi's and other people got interested in our work and asked us to do some work for them as part of their marketing. And it was sort of golden time in a sense, because there's no way that the big ad agencies would have let us near their clients back then. But back then they just thought, oh, this stuff is, this was the days where there was like 2 massive Levi's ads a year, and there was a big campaign behind it. And, all the directors of those ads and the creators were sort of wannabe film directors. And they just saw these little sort of postage stamp stuff that we were doing and thought it was just, juvenile and not important. And, how wrong they were. So, that's where I kind of went through that. And then I went to Australia. I'm fast forwarding a long way. There was a whole kind of Razorfish and .com boom thing in the middle of there as the web took off. And a thing happened there where you could kind of see it happening actually, around 2000, I would say, sort of between sort of 99 and 2001, where a lot of promises were being made. There was a lot of fluff in the air, and a lot of promises being made by people who didn't really understand how to make the stuff, but were kind of doing the selling. And I remember thinking, there's no way you can make what you're selling here or pitching here to your investors and things. And at some moment, this is all going to come crashing down, and it did. And there was a very overheated job market as well, so you had a lot of very inexperienced people asking for a lot of money. And at some point it kind of falls apart, which it did. But just before that, I went to set up the interactive department of a visual effects company and television and commercials company called Animal Logic in Australia. And they are known for now. One of the things that made them famous, they did a lot of TVCs in Australia. But they did the corridor of code and the title sequence of The Matrix as they were moving into film.
Oh, right.
And now they're known for the Lego movies and Happy Feet and those things that they completely did.
So before we go any further, I'm going to come back to this Australia adventure. I just want to go a little back to, because I'm interested in because when you were a kid, you wanted to go into visual effects and film, and I mean, because it's kind of interested, where does that happen? Is it because you were watching a lot of films? Is it because of that? I mean, what was the era where I guess, I mean, was it Star Wars was there at the time? You had I think was it Indiana Jones?
That came afterwards. Yeah,
right.
So I mean, I guess probably Star Wars was the thing, but there were all the sort of Ray Harryhausen films, the stop motion stuff, like Sinbad and was it Clash of the Titans or something like that? I think all of those kind of movies before, and I was fascinated. As they say, the magic of movie making. I was kind of fascinated to see how that stuff was made. There was a few things about it. One was I was kind of really interested in making these visual effects and how they sort of came to life. And I was fascinated by the mixture of artistry and sort of technical prowess in that, and exploration, right? And when you'd hear people talking about it who were making those things, they were like, well, we're kind of making this up as we're going along. And we're not really sure how this is going to work. And so we've invented this thing. And I found that really fascinating. And I think that's probably a bit of a thread through my career, actually. And then, I've always been interested in popular culture. And I was fascinated in the idea. I never really wanted to be, I didn't want to be in front of the camera and be a star. I liked the idea of making a thing that then became part of popular culture. Right. That kind of everyone knew, but that you could still go to the supermarket without being mobbed.
That's very wise for a child to think of those.
I think that came probably as a teenager, but early on, I just wanted to kind of mess around with that stuff.
Did you? And because I'm thinking back to my own childhood, and we would record little like commercials. Or one time, I found the script of Grease, so we recreated Grease. As 8-year-olds do, But what were the kind of things that you were making then as a kid?
So I'd make kind of, I have a picture. So there's a photo, and I found it the other day when I was going through helping my mum clear out some stuff. I had a little action man, the Americans would know G.I. Joes. And he was on a tank, and I had a sort of compost heap. And I remember taking photographs, and I must have been pretty young. I was probably about 6 or 7, taking photographs at these different angles and sort of trying to create these little scenarios. And I don't think I'm kind of unique in that. I mean, I think what you're doing as a kid is trying to recreate the stuff you're enjoying. Right? So I had a computer called a ZX Spectrum when I was about sort of 10, 11, 12, which was a very early home computer, sort of akin to the Commodore. But in the UK, it was a big thing. And my friends and I were starting to try and sort of make our own video game or computer game because that's what we were playing and stuff. So I think that's kind of largely where that impulse comes from.
I did that. Oh my God. I played around with the Commodore. You can program something and you have to, I just know that there's this thing you go and you go run and then you click and you go.
Basic.
Yeah, basic. Yeah. And then something happened and yeah, exactly. Those are exciting times. Although I'm not sure if I mean, in hindsight, to be honest, then it was like, yeah, we just play around with this thing. We had no clue what was going to come next. You know, it's interesting, right? So you have this early home computer, and now looking back, what happened after that is like you can't even imagine. It's amazing actually what changed.
I had a modem actually when I was like 11, 12. It was kind of, it was incredibly slow. I can't remember what it was, like 1300 baud, which is like, your smart lamp probably, speaks fast, communicates faster than that now. But, it was, and it was like a kind of teletext type of, interface. But I remember this idea of sort of getting online, was an amazing thing.
Yeah. But for me, it was because of my father. So my father brought that home because he worked on a lab and they used the computer for work. And so he got a work computer basically. So that was sort of, what did your parents do?
So my dad was, started as an artist and then became a graphic designer and then started his own little sort of one-man and then two-man graphic design and then advertising. So he went graphic design, sort of corporate identity, and then into advertising. And that did pretty well for some time. Got caught in the recession in the late 80s in the UK. And went under. And partly, there was a sort of lesson there, which I see over and over again, which is, over-expanding whilst time is good. And then, advertising is obviously one of the things that gets the axe very quickly when big companies see that things are kind of heading into a recession. So that was kind of slightly painful to watch, I think, as that went under. But that's the sort of background, I guess, of the creative side of things.
Do you remember? I mean, do you have a clear memory of that when you're? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I went to boarding school. I went to private boarding school in the UK, and so I didn't see it kind of day to day, but obviously in the holidays and weekends and stuff I did, and I saw. I mean, it's interesting. They were also like I have this very strong memory of going into the design studio and these amazingly talented people there, doing this everything by hand, right? All these amazing illustrations, and they were, the smell of letraset, that kind of transfer lettering, cowl gum, which is kind of glue they used to use a lot, and spray mount as they were doing all these layouts and stuff. And so they stopped sort of just at the time, it was the mid 80s, I guess. So just at the time where desktop publishing was starting to kind of make its way into businesses, there was a sort of crossover period. And they had some technology, but not really. They didn't really use computers for anything. And I have a very kind of strong memory of that and the kind of creativity in the work they did, but also how you really saw the sort of split loyalties in the advertising industry. I guess when things were starting to go bad, some people were really, really nice. Some suppliers and clients of my dad's, and some were just like, oh, I'm out of here. It's not. I don't think it's a particularly pleasant industry quite a lot of the time.
No, I totally agree. Interesting the way you described. Actually, the smells that you're saying, the glue and that kind of and ink and lettering and paper and all these things have. So to me, so my mother's side, they were all artists, and so my grandfather was quite a known artist in the Netherlands. And for me, the sort of pencil, when I sharpen pencil or paint, it brings me back to my grandparents and my house. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that smell. That's such a strong. It creates such a strong urge to kind of start drawing.
Yeah, it's very quick and just brings you straight back there. I
Right?
think.
Is that it? Because somehow, but although it's, I mean, I can describe it as a
That's my
smell.
dog.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I recognize the sound. I have a dog too. It sounds exactly the same. Little nails on the.
Yeah.
But the sort of that kind of that has such a big influence on how I still kind of somehow see myself, or it's part of me, although it wasn't me because I wasn't the painter and I wasn't doing that. But I kind of, it's still part of my identity. And so, were there things that, or are you recognizing things now that you've seen in your parents or your father in this case? I mean, obviously, the lesson of the problem in the ups and downs of being an entrepreneur.
The weird thing is, yeah. So my father then kind of he sort of went back to his art and stuff afterwards. But I really kind of one of the things for me that sorry about my dog tapping around in the background. It's being a bit restless.
Okay.
I think one of the things for me is he was about my age when his business went under. And it's kind of funny. It's a very kind of weird thing now, I think, to look back. And, again, he died last year and we're kind of looking back through photos and stuff. And you kind of look at significant moments in your childhood and see, oh my God, they were in their 30s then, or they were in their sort of early 40s then, and realizing that, you're beyond where they were now. And yet they, it seemed so mature, and parenty and stuff back then. And I think kind of where that fits in for me, and one of the things I bring into the coaching a lot, and all this idea of what's the sort of inner journey that you're going through, is I think of time, or your time, as the fossil fuels of your life, right? They're this precious resource that you never get back, and not only that, you don't know how much is left. And when I see this culture of always be hustling, always be doing, this sort of hyper productivity culture. And, COVID really put a pause on this, which was good. But I still see it a lot with coachees. One of my coachees recently said, one of the great things they got out of coaching, and he works for a large consultancy, he said, was to not take work so seriously. And I think it's really important because you can get very, very wound up, very, very stressed, make yourself ill, burn out, because you're being pushed, and you take on that kind of push to be incredibly stressed and worry about what generally is a set of made-up numbers not matching another set of made-up numbers in order to make wealthy people more wealthy quicker. And it's really important to kind of reframe that. And I'm not saying you shouldn't work hard. I'm not saying you shouldn't be productive and all of those things. But it's really important to get a sense of kind of where the values are there and decide, if I'm going to spend this precious resource of my time, who do I spend it with? Because when you're working for a company and they pay you, and people feel sort of a bit guilty, I think, about being paid sometimes, and perhaps more so from design. Your job is to earn them back more money. They'll always get back what they're giving to you. In fact, they'll earn more than they're giving to you because that's the way it works, right? So the idea that you're giving a finite resource to them in order to help them generate more of a renewable resource is a really important reframe to kind of think about what you're going to do with your time. And so looking back over, say my father's life or something like that, I think that really kind of influences how I think about that stuff.
Yeah, I think so. Kind of same for me when I think about my father. He's now 84. And he wanted to change his job when he was, I think, 40, 41 or so. And then, but he couldn't, he was too old. Nobody wanted him. And so I'm thinking, he was only 41.
Yeah.
Right. But I think, I don't know the numbers, but there has been plenty of research that showed that, most people, I think, working in large organizations are unhappy in their job. And yes, and as you said, COVID kind of has I think it's speeding things up a little bit in the sense that, in the US, you have the big resignation. People don't want to go back to their cubicles again. And because but you hear that all the time. And if you work for large organizations, people will feel miserable because one time someone told me she was working at this big French company, and she said, every day here is a marathon. And but all the value that's created is going to sucked up to the top of the pyramid. Why am I doing this? And I think and I talked to her about at that time, basically the way I framed it was like, because they were worried about keeping talent in the company because they were leaving, and especially and I said, new generations, they have a different relationship to work. Like my father, work was security, was pension. He couldn't risk that. That was really important. So it wasn't because I think he kind of liked his job, but that wasn't really the most important thing. It was security for his family and for his pension. And so I said to this French lady from this company, no, it's new generation, blah, blah, blah. And she was, I think at the time, probably in her 50s. And she said, Arna, it's not just new generations. It's everyone. Yeah. I mean, we all want to work differently, and she talked about this one moment where, in this big, very traditional French company, the CEO, there was a big meeting, a lot of people there, and the CEO mentioned the word happiness, and they fell off their chairs. They were like, did he say happy? Did he say happiness? We have to be happy? And because, right? And the word happiness.
We have to be happy.
Yeah, right. But it's like this. It's like that. You don't talk about that, which is how odd is that?
Yeah, it's so far outside their realm of understanding of their job that when he mentions it, it's like, did that just come from him? It's
yeah, right. So Andy, so for me, the way I always kind of thought about it is that I mean, I'm not really big in conspiracy theories. I love them, by the way. It's amazing. I love flat earthers, and it's fantastic. So because it tells you so much about human psychology and groupthink and all that. It's amazing. But if there's one conspiracy I think we did to ourselves, is this idea of work-life balance. Yeah. Right? Like, there's only life. There's no. What do you mean work-life balance?
I think the biggest lie is in business is this idea of it's not personal, it's business. That you can somehow separate the two, and COVID did really bring that home, that those two aren't separated. But it's always been the way, right? It's always been the case that those two things weren't separate. We just kind of felt we could, and there's sort of historical reasons for that, because certainly in blue collar factory work, you basically left you could leave, your mind was your own, your thoughts were your own. You could kind of leave your mind, if you like, at home and go to work, and your body was being kind of worked more than anything, because the whole point of a factory was, unskilled labor, and the whole sort of Taylorist thing, which we now know is sort of based on quite a lot of fake data from Taylor. But this idea that, we can break stuff down into sort of discrete tasks and just anyone can do this. And so it just becomes mindless. And that's not been the case. And there's a whole lot of privilege wrapped up in that, of course, because it's not been the case then for white collar workers who've, get to sort of bring more of their full selves to work. And then, of course, the sort of the upper class who didn't work at all. And lived off everyone else's labour. So there's a background to that. And even if you kind of move forward into, say, what we were talking about with your dad or our grandparents, there was a longevity to the companies they were working for. Their work-life balance was very, very different. I think it's really interesting if you look at even watching something like The Crown, and you see that there's, up until very, very recent, there's no computers on people's desks. People are writing a letter. Or they're writing a draft of a letter and someone goes and types it up and all that stuff, which also means, yes, you might have had a telephone in your home. Very rarely would it have been used for work, right? And all of that stuff. So that the difference, the separation was a lot easier to keep. And not only that, then the kind of promise of, that your pension's going to be there and then it's going to be enough and all of those kinds of things. There was a small period of time when that was the case. And the average lifespan of S&P 500 companies has fallen by, I think, about 80%. It's something like sort of from 65 or so to 15 years now. And so, it's a much, much more, a much quicker cycle. And so a lot of that kind of thinking on what that was based or a lot of the stuff on what that thinking was based has gone away. So there's no way, I mean, like you and I, there's no way that my daughter or even my students at the moment are going to have one career in their lifetime. They will have several. And that's the sort of new normal.
But still, we educate them as if...
we educate as a factory, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Which is to me, so if I look at my daughter and now she's 16, almost 17, and she has to kind of choose what she wants to be.
I know, it's absurd.
And she doesn't know. And I keep telling her, it doesn't matter what you choose. It's not going to be that anyway. It might be your first job, maybe, who knows? But there's going to be plenty of other things you're going to be doing. But the whole system is kind of geared towards, you have to kind of go into a direction. And when you're when you're a teenager, at the right, exactly at the time that's the worst time to make decisions anyway. But when you're a teenager, we your story is, it does kind of start with, you wanted to be in visual effects, you wanted to be movie making, so you kind of take all these little things on your way. You do, you have these different jobs, different experiences. You kind of get different skills. You go into interaction design. Nobody knew what that was. And you grow, so you become a teacher, et cetera, et cetera. That's actually really common. I hear that kind of stories a lot, where even what you started doing as a kid later really start making sense. Like, oh yeah, I've always been interested in that, and I've always done that. But school doesn't really pay attention to that at all, which is such a
it's the industrialization of school a little bit. I mean, my daughter, we took the decision to put my daughter in a Steiner school, which here is not really a kind of private school; it's still kind of part of the system, and so which is nice. And there's much more rounded. The arts and humanities are much. Very much more included in the curriculum. It's not this very, very narrow focus on STEM, nor on kind of grades and stuff. It's only she's 14 now, as of about, next year that they do any kind of grading or anything, which I think, it's been fantastic that. And I think that to sort of bring it back to that kind of journey, one of the things I did when I was about 16, 17 and having to choose what in the UK, my A-levels would be, I remember thinking, well, what jobs would I like, and finding out the sort of A-levels you'd want to do. And I'd think, well, I don't really like those subjects very much. And so I took the choice to do the subjects that I enjoyed, because I thought, well, if I enjoy that, then I'm probably going to enjoy the work, the job that is, going to use those. Whereas I saw friends who were like, well, I want to be a lawyer and something, or, a doctor, and they were having to take these subjects that they kind of really hated and was really grinding through it. Now, I don't know whether they go on and enjoy their work or not, but I have seen several of my closer friends take major pivots in their careers. And it's kind of something that's stuck with me now, when we don't often, I think there's a lot of kind of drift that happens. Some people really plan out their careers, but I don't know how much their actual career matches their plans. But I think we often go from role to role to role, and we kind of think, oh, that looks interesting, My next role should be, this, I'm a lead now, or I'm a senior now, my next role should be a lead. And we sort of climb the ladder that is placed in front of us and don't do that much reflection about, but actually the role is an abstraction, right, of what your daily life is. And it's the day-to-day activities that either energize you or grind you down. So you could be the chief design officer for somewhere, and your daily life is spent on Teams calls, Microsoft Teams calls, trying to persuade kind of senior leadership of the value of design. Now, if that energizes you, and I know a couple of people for whom that's the case, that's fine. But, I mean, I still do spend my life on Zoom calls, but I do it with coaching, and that's what energizes me. I think I would get kind of frustrated and bored probably by doing that other role, of keep sort of repeating myself over and over again, to sort of senior stakeholders. For other people, sometimes they take on a role, and actually they find that what they're doing every day just they don't really enjoy it. Sorry, dog again. He's a Dachshund. He's got long ears and he shakes his head. And for other people, I think, one of the things I do with the coaching is to look through, and it's what I did for myself, like what are the things that if I look back on my life and I think about the times when I really enjoyed what I was doing, and I had that sort of spring in my step afterwards. I felt energized. I call it that sort of in love feeling, actually, where you're kind of feeling a little bit floaty, it's like, in flow. What was I doing? Who was I with? What were we doing? Why were we doing it? And what was the purpose of what we were doing? And what was the, very, very tangibly, were we in a workshop? Were we up at the whiteboard? Were we on, a Zoom call and batting ideas around on, Miro or something, and that's really, really important because it's the stuff. Your body doesn't lie, usually.
Can you describe one of those moments where you, where are you?
Yeah, so for me, what actually then, as I was thinking about this when I was when I'd left Fjord and Accenture, and I was thinking, well, what is it that I want to do? I knew that I really liked this kind of mentoring and coaching process. And I'd done it a lot with students from undergraduates right the way through to postgraduates, and doctorate students. I really liked, that was a large part of what I did, the sort of educational stuff, was teaching. When I was both both in a university, but also at Fjord. Part of my job was training other people and clients and people in Accenture too, and Fjordians. And I really liked that. And I really liked writing, and I like podcasting too. And so I kind of thought, reverse engineered it and thought, well, how, what kind of career can I build out of this? Now, for other people, it's different. Other people really
but I want to be
a
little bit more specific because this is very, very general. So, what is the moment where you go like that I got that kind of that what do you call that floaty that
sort of feeling, I think there's two things. For me, there's a sort of penny drop moment. So, whether it's teaching or facilitating a workshop and those kinds of things, where there's this moment, first of all, there's an energy to that. Right? And secondly, there's this moment where you can just see people light up and get it, something that had been very messy, I say murky, but it's probably just more messy. And in service design, because that's a whole ecosystem view of things, there's this moment where everything's connected to everything else, just don't get it. And then there's this moment where you kind of find the right, sometimes it's like the Zoom level, the right granularity to look at this. Sometimes it's the right sort of metaphor or analogy, and it just kind of clicks, and then everyone really kind of gets it. Or you see there's 3 or 4 different concepts that people are working on, and you see how there's a moment where you say, oh, do you know what? These all fit together as a coherent whole. And that's really great.
Yeah.
For in teaching, a moment where someone who's been confused by something suddenly just gets it. It's incredibly rewarding.
So it's you can tell because the way they respond or kind of just you can tell that you made impact.
Yeah, exactly. The feedback loop is quite short on that.
Right, on one person, right? It's a person.
Yeah.
It's not.
Or it can be a class or a group.
Yeah.
And I think in coaching there are moments where I guess there's 2 things there for me. One is these moments of realization as I start off with quite a lot of self-reflection, kind of like we've been doing here. And then there are these moments where people realize how something from earlier is shaping the way they think about this now, or there's some kind of reframe in what they're looking at now, or dealing with now that completely changes the way they respond to it, and therefore sort of unlocks them from what's often a bit of a kind of painful dynamic. Yeah. And it's, you can see there's like this kind of penny drop again there, and this kind of freeing moment. And then afterwards, when they reflect back on it, on the coaching of how things are different, to see their lives improve in some way, to have the confidence or courage to either, whether it's speaking in front to the C-suite or whether it's going off and doing their own thing, that's super rewarding too.
Yeah.
And for yourself, have you had one of those penny drop moments for yourself?
For me, when the pennies dropped for me,
Yeah, like a recent penny
yeah,
drop.
yeah, quite a lot. In fact, I mean, it was the sort of beginning of the coaching for me, where I'd obviously been doing quite a lot of it informally, both as a senior leader in Fjord and then in my educational role too, and in other areas. And there was a moment where, so when I left Accenture, my contract finished at the end of February, and I'll tell you the year in a second. And I was like, I had a few clients lined up for doing some training stuff for their design teams. And I said, well, as of the 1st of March, I can sign the contracts. And that was the 1st of March, 2020. And so, lockdown and COVID all just kind of kicked in. And
Yes.
and one of the things that happened was training budgets, because in the minds of the powers that be at those organizations, training meant a lot of people coming together in one place, even though we were probably going to do it remotely. And, everything just kind of went topsy-turvy. But during that time, my wife, who is a psychoanalyst, she was listening to me having a phone call with one of my potential clients. And the phone call went on for like 2 hours, because the first bit was about the training thing. And then the second kind of hour was this person saying, yeah, I'm really not sure, how I can get more traction with stakeholders. And, I'm really struggling to think about how I should set up the team stuff. So I was I was sort of coaching them through it, just to get the sort of, to get the job, as to be a good kind of sales call. And my wife was the one who said, why are you giving that all away for free? And I had this penny drop moment of like, oh yeah, that's the work. And I really enjoy that, actually.
Oh yeah, that's really cool. Very cool. Oh, that's the work. Yeah,
that's the work. And and I think that happens quite often, where people go, I realize that, oh, it's not this.
Yeah.
And, that happens a lot in the coaching, where someone comes in and goes, so I'm coming into coaching because I've got these problems and I'm having this struggle. And about 3 or 4 sessions in, there's always a moment. Whereas there's a Jungian analyst called James Hollis who says, it's never about what it's about, and there's this moment where they come in and they go, oh, it's session 3 or 4. It's not that, it's this. And that's the stuff we need to work on.
And that is the thing I'm guessing that gives you that feeling of when you kind of uncover what it's actually about.
Yeah,
So
it's great. It's really
right.
Great.
That's I recognize that. I think everyone who's in coaching or teaching or facilitation probably has that, enjoys those moments the best, because that's when you kind of break through. You go, that's the thing. And you don't, it's basically in the heads of the people that you're either coaching or facilitating. That's where it happens. All of a sudden you see it in the penny drops in their heads. Because even though you kind of felt there was something going on, and all of a sudden goes like, oh yeah, right. And that's so rewarding. And so to me personally, I mean, I think, I don't know if you kind of have the same kind of experience there, but if you do a lot of work for large organizations, specifically large organizations that are kind of, very complex, and there's so much happening, so much politics and emotions and all that stuff. It's great. I like that. I like kind of the puzzle and the game, and the sort of like to see sort of what's happening in the kitchen, basically. That's great. But actually being able to, you're having someone in front of you, and seeing them kind of get it, or somehow the penny drop, or just have an emotional connection somehow, opposed to, doing a project for a big company and, did a whole bunch of workshops.
Got a lot of journey maps and concepts. And then
yes, exactly. Yeah, they're like, all right. and then, especially in the early days of service design, nothing really happened, because they couldn't really implement, and so that I think, and maybe that's sort of also a little bit of a segue into kind of the topic of design leadership or creative leadership, is where, because I feel that the early days of service design, and generalizing, obviously, we spend a lot of time in doing workshops and kind of doing inspirational workshop, creative workshops, coming up with great ideas, et cetera, but really, making impact into the machine, if you will, really changing things. We're only starting. And I think leadership is where it needs to happen. It really, that's sort of the next level, where you go like, actually, now we need to really have a strong top-down kind of leadership as well. And if we've been talking about kind of designers being in in the boardroom, et cetera. But I don't know if that's it. But design leadership, creative leadership. So I'll tell you what I think. And we just had our previous podcast was also about this actually, but it was about design leadership being sort of teaching, generalizing, of simplifying here, but teaching designers the language of business, whereas creative leadership is teaching the business people the language of design. Then it's simplified.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah.
So where are you in this story, and how, what's your thinking about this?
So I had a conversation yesterday and the day before actually, or last week, and I feel like we're coming back around a cycle. I feel like I'm having the same conversations that I had about 20 years ago, about this industrial, we talked about it before with education, this sort of industrial model of kind of thinking about businesses. And that was one of the sort of big things about talking about service design, saying the sort of the 20 teens, was this idea of, moving from this industrial model, this idea that a company is a factory that kind of produces a thing and then that gets shipped, to seeing, services are these ecosystems that are never finished. My favorite metaphor for this is gardens, right? You don't ever say we've shipped the garden. It's never finished, right? You're constantly tweaking it and messing with it. And I think that's much more what services are like. And most things are services, as you know. And I think, I'll come back to the kind of business thing in a second, but I think one of the things that's happened with the rise of product, which has been sort of great in many respects, and I see a lot of parallels in product to a certain level with the sort of production process in film and TV. It's quite sort of regimented is maybe a bit too harsh, but it's there's a sort of process there. One of the downsides of it is that I think it's re-industrialized design. I mean that a lot of the red thread that ran through from research into insights. I mean, that book was called From Insights. The tagline was From Insight to Implementation, for a reason, right? Because of this idea that you really need to be able to kind of carry that through and not keep breaking stuff into smaller chunks, because the bigger ecosystem is too difficult to get your head around, the complexity. Or if you do divide it up, that you still maintain the links and where one touch point leads into the next, or where people sort of shift channels, what the kind of bridges. The delivery work talk about these as on and off ramps, between those things are really important. And I think, in the worst case of like sort of feature factories in kind of product, what's happened is designers researchers got split off. And at Fjord, for example, we always made sure that the designers, all flavors of designers, were also doing some research. There might be someone who's a research specialist setting it up, but they were all going out and speaking to people right the way through to sort of the other end. But I see, feature teams, or sometimes it's divided by feature, sometimes it's by a sort of moment in the journey or whatever, and squads or teams or whatever they're called. And they're split up, and you often have like one or two designers in each one, and they don't really have that common thread across each other. And as a discipline, it's got kind of split up again. So it's like they're all on different bits of the assembly line. Design, I think, is partly to blame here. I think there's a generation of people who shifted, either wanted to just immediately come out of uni and do that, or shifted to being product designers because that's where the hot salaries were, and kind of allowed themselves to have that sort of strategic and the thinking role, ironically, even design thinking, sort of taken away, and a lot of that has got kind of pushed, taken back into project management and product management and product. And I think part of the issue there is that fragments everything again. And our whole thing in service design was, hey, we want to try and sort of, if not break down the silos, at least build bridges and sort of make them porous between them, so that we understand how everything affects everything else. And so that's sort of become re-industrialized, and that's why I feel like I'm having that sort of conversation all over again.
Yeah.
I think what it has happened in business is that kind of systems thinking, ecosystems thinking, is not naturally part of the kind of language of, not naturally, it's not culturally part of the way that a lot of people who go and do an MBA think. It's very much still very industrial, that a business is a machine, and your job as senior leadership is to optimize the running of that machine, rather than a business is a garden, and your job is to try and is keep an eye on kind of what's growing too fast, what's not growing and not thriving, and to create the preconditions for everything to thrive, and to respond to environmental conditions. And so I think that's a kind of a side effect of the rise of product. For all of the good it is, and I'm friends with lots of really kind of well-known product people, and I don't mean this as an insult, but I think a side effect of it has been it's allowed people in business to get back into sort of bad habits again, or slip back into bad habits, because even the language of product. I gave a talk about this at Mind the Product in Hamburg last year, about that. The language sets your mental model, right? There's this phrase of words create worlds, and so if you talk about product, right, a thing that is a discrete entity that then gets shipped. No one ships anything. If we talked about people, we deploy the code, and so you upload some stuff to someone else's computer somewhere else in the world, right? It doesn't sound as sexy to say we FTP'd some things, but basically that's all you're doing is you're putting some stuff. We planted some code in the existing garden, in the ecosystem. That's really what's going on. And so the idea, though, that kind of industrial language that surrounds product, I actually think is really problematic, because I think it allows businesses and business people who may be not in that world to go back into, okay, so now we can just plan everything again. Now we can just break stuff down into discrete stuff that we can manage, because that's what managers do. And I think that's a kind of real problem.
So, but in a way, don't you think that's sort of a very natural? Because there's a topic around this, and there's the whole theory, which I don't think I'm allowed to talk about because it's way out of my league. But it's this edge of chaos, and this idea that everything kind of goes from chaos to order, and that's sort of how evolution works. That everything works out. But I kind of use that concept to kind of think about also things like service design thinking, and all that, because you go to kind of from order to chaos. And when you are at the edge of chaos, that's where we are most creative, because this is where all the things are possible all of a sudden, and new connections are being made. If it becomes too chaotic, it falls apart, and kind of the ecosystem dies. So you have to go. So the natural way is to then go to order, more order, because we kind of we can start structuring things and make it more effective, efficient, whatever. But if there's too much order, then it becomes disconnected, like you were describing, and then it kind of also dies, because there's no connection, there's no energy flowing throughout the system, and so it falls apart. So the way things kind of evolve is you always go from chaos to order, never that neat, like there's all kinds of happening at the same time, obviously. But that kind of gives me always a bit of a sense of I'm kind of okay with it then, and go like, oh yeah, we're there. Now we have to create a new narrative again. And to create a little bit more chaos, there needs to be a little bit more opening. There needs to be we have to kind of break the system a little bit again. And that needs a different language, new stories, because to your point, I totally agree that it's the language that creates sort of the way we understand the world. That creates our reality, right? So to me, I think things like creative leadership and the language that we create around that, is that a kind of part of that new language that is going to create a little bit more opening and a little bit more chaos? Yeah.
So it's about which one's appropriate at the time. I mean, I think when I think about, say, leading teams, one of the things I talk about is this idea of sometimes teams get very rigid, and they can get very dogmatic about method, for example, and designers can get really kind of dogmatic about method, and this is the jobs to be done, and this is not this is how you do jobs to be done, all that kind of stuff. And what they need is to be shaken up a bit, and sort of taken out of that solid state and made a bit more fluid. Sometimes teams and companies are very gaseous. They're going all over the place, and everything's kind of bouncing off of each other very quickly. And what they need is some kind of container to bring them down. And a thing I found quite a lot as a design director was, particularly around synthesis. It's one of the most messy moments of a project. And there was this thing where I could tell from the body language. We're going into a room. There's all these post-it notes up in the room, on the wall, and people would be slightly sort of hunched forward and kind of looking forlornly at the walls, and you could just tell they had that analysis paralysis. And one of the things they would do is say, okay, here's, draw on a big flip chart. Here's a template. This is what we need, top 3 insights, top 3 needs, whatever, and, some other stuff. And within half an hour, they go, oh, look, I go back in. They go, oh, that didn't really work for us, Andy, so we've done this. And that was the whole point, right? The point wasn't for them to do what I said. The point was, as soon as you put a container around someone, they start banging their elbows up against it and start to work out where their own edges are. And I think this is true. What you were talking about before, in terms of sort of businesses, that idea of sort of riding that chaos cycle is really, really important to sort of recognize that's what's going on, rather than this idea of captain of industry sort of charting a course through choppy waters. You're really kind of riding a greasy pig and just trying to kind of hang on. And I think that
good image.
I think businesses, so that's one of the frictions, right? Where, because organizations, pretty large organizations, if you think of all the other structural things like HR and IT and facilities and, legal and procurement in particular, they're all there to try and keep the status quo. Right? And so there's this kind of tension between what the business actually sort of needs to do and sort of embrace the chaos wave a bit, and what structurally they're set up. Large structures in the organization are trying to kind of pull them back from. And there's a lot of fear and anxiety that goes on there. And I'm convinced that, business, or the world of work is laced with fear and anxiety. And that's kind of one of the biggest problems of that split between personal and professional, is that people aren't open and honest about that. If a stakeholder, most people aren't annoying and difficult for the sake of it. They're like that because they're anxious and afraid. And, the more you can kind of get to that, the more you can understand it and try and think, what's this person really afraid of here? Why are they being an absolute arse? And how can I kind of unlock that? The more you make a progression. On the other hand, with design, I think design has done, and creative leadership, I think, is a switch of language. And I slightly bristle at the whole kind of designers need to learn business thing, because I don't think that business is actually a real thing. What do we mean when we say, need to learn the language of business? Are we talking numbers? Are we talking how are kind of the, shareholder value and how the dynamics of that work? Are we talking sort of these kind of, Six Sigma kind of management style thing? What do we actually mean? And I think what we mean is, need to understand that there's an inward-facing view around the organization and its growth and the things that matter in terms of impact to the organization that is separate from what designers usually look at, which is, how can we hug our customers more? How do we make the kind of this perfect end-user experience? And one of the difficult things, I think, in creative leadership is to constantly switch your vocabulary. That, when you're talking to designers and you've spent your entire career talking design to other designers, that actually the rude sort of awakening when you're in a creative leadership role is the CEO and the C-suite. They don't care about that. They don't care about design. And it seems a bit offensive even that they don't. What they care about is, whatever indices and metrics that they're trying to kind of push upwards. And design, I think, has done a pretty bad job of doing the storytelling, of linking the kind of work that we know is important as design to business impact in a way that sort of keeps that linkage intact. I see a lot of creative leaders sort of just become numbers people. And then what's the point of you? What's the point of you compared to any other MBA? And if they're not really bringing that design lens to that, senior leadership conversation, then you've kind of lost something there, and that's a really tricky balance, I think. But a lot of it, I think, is to do with the storytelling of things.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And it is fascinating, and in a way, listening to you, I kind of started thinking that if a company, a company is like, it's like a living and breathing entity. It is, if you think about it, and if you would coach that, you would also go to kind of what is that spark? What is it? And often it's been there in the beginning of when the company starts. It's the root is where, the origin story of the company, right? Like the origin story of a person. There's these moments of transition, but there's also this link to where you came from. And I think, and while you were talking, there's procurement, there is HR, there is, IT, and we kind of, often companies basically forgot where they came from. And I find myself often as a consultant being in an organization, reminding them of, do you know where you started? And I'm not just talking about the kind of the metaphorical garage, but basically it's always an entrepreneur, someone who tried something, and it's always about a trial and error. Always someone tried something, and then they found something, and then all of a sudden they built this whole organization around it, and they forgot to kind of they forgot their roots, they forgot where they came from, and in a way, the complexity of an organization, because they're so not, there's no interconnection between all the different departments, and there's this feeling of unsafety. So these cultures of fear, which are they're so real.
Yeah.
I think that's such a, so for a in a way, as a creative leader, I think that's your task somehow, to kind of coach the company and to create a sort of to create a safe space to really get a better understanding of who you are.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to create a safe space from underneath, as exactly. Many people who will
exactly
are in kind of marginalized communities will tell you. I think that I'm not sure that safe space is the thing. I mean, I don't mean psychologically safe for kind of people who work there. I think that's important. But what I'm saying is I think it's important for to reframe it that safety is an illusion. I talked about the sort of decline in the length of lifespan of S&P, all those S&P companies. It's the same. It's also the same in coaching, when people are thinking about setting up as an independent. And one of the things they talk about is, I don't want to leave the security, though, of my paid job. It's like, yeah, but you could get fired tomorrow, right? What does that actually, what does security actually look like to you? And then you kind of unpack that. And then they have this moment of going, oh, yeah, well, actually, if I have, this much in savings and have these things set up, I'm actually as safe, if not safer, than in my full-time job. And I think part of the thing is to do that, you're right, is a coaching thing with the company. And what do we mean by that? Was usually sort of senior leadership to say, that fear and anxiety, that worry about sort of risk, let's unpack that some more, and not just kind of go, that's too risky, but let's unpack what risk means to you, and pre-catastrophize, what would it look like? How could this all terribly go wrong? And that's obviously one of the things that designers are really good at, is taking abstract ideas and conversations and making them tangible. I think designers forget that this is like magic to other people.
Yes.
To say, when you're talking about the thing, let's sketch up a storyboard of this. So you mean like this? And then everyone's aligned, everyone's looking at the same thing. And then you can go, oh, yeah, well, actually, now I see it. No, it's not quite like that. And it's either not as good or it's not as terrible as I thought it was. That's an incredibly powerful tool. And that's what I mean by bringing those skills into that leadership level.
Yeah. And I don't mean with the safe space that, everybody feel, I mean, this feeling of safety means to me that you can actually, this sounds, maybe that's a contradiction. There can be tension, and that's okay in a safe space. So you can sort of feel unsafe and worried, but it's basically, you can talk about it. You can make things explicit in a safe space. Yeah. So if you're not in a safe space, then what happens is that people don't talk about things, and they pretend that there's something going on. So I think that, and I don't know if that's a creative leader, or I think it's the people in general in organizations, whatever you're called. What's really key is that, because the worst thing that can happen, I know I didn't come up with this. I read this somewhere online, which stuck with me. He's like, the worst thing that can happen to a CEO is when nobody tells you what's wrong, right?
Yeah.
So, right,
Elon
that's
Musk.
the right. That's the worst. Yeah. Right. That's the worst. That's the worst thing, right? And it's not just in. That's also in friendship, by the way.
Mm.
Right. If they don't tell you, basically, Arnie, you should brush your teeth. You smell, or something. Right? That's the worst thing. You didn't tell me.
Yeah.
You should tell me that, right? And I think that is part of safe space. And I don't know if we need a complete. So you talk about gardens, and I agree. But are these actually the same organizations? Don't you think that the way we created sort of the businesses as we know them now are actually going to disappear anyway? Not the way they're structured, the way they're organized. They might not be the right organizations. We might need, you might call them ecosystems, and so that needs a new language and a new kind of way of thinking about it. But I think the world needs sort of a new way of organizing, a new way of distributing value. It might be a bit naive, but I still think that if we're looking at the evolution of organizations, we're kind of going that way.
No, that's definitely true, because the work that I'm doing is in systemic transitions in terms of the research. And there's just more and more discoveries and literature coming out that everything is needing to shift. So this concept of gardens and this edge of chaos. So everything you guys are saying is also then lighting up perfectly with everything that I'm researching. And then I'm specifically looking in the role of facilitator. So then what Andy's kind of doing is coach and guiding people through this process.
That's good to hear.
It's spot on. Yeah.
But it is, it does run in, against, or it does grind against this not very long history. It's like 150 years of sort of the idea of a corporation, of this stable structure. And I think we quoted at the end of our book. We talked about, and at the end of my PhD, called Alvin Toffler. He wrote this book called The Third Wave, and this metaphor of the waves was, there was sort of agrarian wave and then industrial wave and so forth. And as one wave recedes, it sort of sweeps around the world. But sometimes one wave is still sweeping around the world whilst another one is receding, and so you get like this riptide. If you've ever lived in Australia, you sometimes really see it, like the kind of the backwash meets the wave coming in, and the water just kind of sprays up in the air, and there's this kind of friction there, or it's like tectonic plates, they sort of grind against each other. And I kind of feel we're absolutely in a period of that. And then if you took the long view and you just go, well, that's always been the case, but it does definitely feel, if you do take the long view, you see, that industrialization is such a tiny kind of blip at the moment, in the kind of longer view of human existence. It'll be interesting to see how that kind of pans out. But I think that, to bring it back to the kind of film stuff, there's two things. One was, Arnie, when you were talking about that sort of coaching thing, Mark Curtis is one of the co-founders of Fjord, and I still use this in my storytelling and sort of pitching, presenting workshop. Talked about this idea of, design's job, whether you're a consultant or internally, is to be like the trusted mentor. So, Obi-Wan Kenobi, but my favorite ones are like Donkey in Shrek and Dory in Finding Nemo, because they tell the hero the thing they need to hear that they probably don't want to hear at the time. And what's so brilliant about sort of Donkey in Shrek is, Eddie Murphy's, there's no filter there, right? Just saying everything that kind of occurs to him about Shrek at any moment. He has absolutely no fear either of Shrek, and all of the usual kind of dynamic has gone away. And I think that's a kind of a really nice way to think about it, and that's very important. And the second thing is, now sort of legendary, is Pixar's kind of brain's trust. This thing that they do when they recognize that every film director, as they're kind of putting together the story, there's a moment where they kind of slightly lose control of it. It's got sort of messy and chaotic. And so they have this brain's trust, and it's a group of people. It's made up of other, directors, made of other sort of trusted people in the organization. And they take the script and the story and they just really kind of pull it apart and rebuild it again. but it's understood that this is not an attack on that person who's the director. This is the way this process works.
Yeah.
Right? And then we're looking at this third thing, and we're really trying to make it into the best it can possibly be. And that's what I kind of, when you were talking about the safe space and stuff, that's what I kind of understand as a safe space. You know, that the focus is not on the person, but it's on this thing. And that has to be really intentional, the way that is structured, but there also has to be a lot of understanding of like, this is just the process of this thing. Like all projects are going to go through, I was talking about synthesis before, all projects go through like a messy middle, and synthesis is one of those areas. And you have to kind of trust that, you know, we'll come out the other side of this and not panic and not have the fear and anxiety kick in.
Which kind of combines also we combine safe space, but also the sort of willingness to let go, and order and chaos.
Yeah.
So creativity needs this chaos, but then you need order in that creative process as well, which is what drew me to design thinking, really, because to me that was what it was, sort of order and chaos. You know, you can create chaos and then put it back in order again, but then you have to break it again because that creates new options. And creative leadership for me is someone who creates these options you didn't even know were possible. So it stretches those boundaries. That's someone who says, yeah, but you can also go here, you know, push it a little further, you know, and then everybody goes like, oh, I'm allowed to do that, or is that okay? So I think that's where a creative leader should come in, whether that's a designer or not. It's just someone who gives all these options. And so, and I kind of want to link back because, you know, I do really want to talk about sort of your maybe a possible upcoming book. Yeah. And I was reading the sort of there's a little blog post you wrote down on navigating the leadership dip.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to so first of all, because this is part of your journey, right? So here you are, you go like, yeah, this is a topic I want to write something about.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about this?
Yeah, sure. So I wrote this piece a kind of a while ago, and I've been thinking about, I talked about it like over the years. My first sort of real leadership role was at Animal Logic, and I was pretty young. I was like 29, I think. And, you know, I was the interactive director there. I was setting up this interactive department. And, you know, I had been used to being very hands-on and making stuff. And it was the sort of first time where I wasn't really making that much stuff myself. And I thought, well, I'm going to hire lots of people who are much better than me at different things, because that seems like a smart thing to do. And when I was looking at the work that they were doing, it was kind of like, yeah, it's okay. But I've seen you do better work than that. I didn't say that, but I was thinking I've seen them do better work than that. And, you know, I had this terrible imposter syndrome moment, you know, where I was talking to someone and he was struggling, but not struggling, but he was trying to decide between two designs, I think, for a website. And we were talking about it, and I was saying, well, maybe this could be like this, and I think maybe loosen this bit up here, whatever it was. And I was thinking, God, if he turns around and says, well, you do it then, I wouldn't be able to do it. You know, I'm not a particularly good visual designer. And I noticed what happened is he would start defending. He started to sort of defend one idea, and then but the other one go, yeah, you know, and that's what I was thinking too. And he just had that moment where he just got too close to the work and needed someone else to bounce it off of, you know. And I kind of realized that my job was to sort of direct or to enable and that team and sort of design through them, but in a way, but kind of to enable that team that they actually needed. And when I started actively doing it more, the work really improved. And it wasn't because I was great, it was because I was actually just kind of helping them come out of that chaos moment and kind of help them to focus. And like I said, you put a frame around someone, they start kind of bouncing against it, and they start to realize, okay, yeah, no, you're telling me that's not working, but I'll tell you all the reasons why it is. And it's like, okay, well, maybe that's then the right one. And what I realized was, I'm just kind of finding out this stuff. And there's probably other people who've been doing this, leading teams for years, and this is really obvious. But I had this moment, this dip, which I've seen then in coaching, and I've seen a lot of other people have, where as they start to let go of the sort of identity of I make things, they start to take on another one of leadership and management, and those are slightly kind of overlapping but separate. And there's a dip in the middle where you're kind of not very good at either of them anymore, or you're not very good at the kind of making anymore, and you're still a beginner in the leadership thing. And yet, at that moment, you're supposed to be at the top. You're at the top of the pyramid, and you're supposed to know about what you're doing. And quite often, you're the only one in the company who is that senior as a designer. And it can be quite. It can kind of kick off quite an existential crisis for people. And I think it's a bit unspoken because I obviously I see it in all the coaches I've had a lot, and it resonates a lot with people where people just, some of it's imposter syndrome, but it's more than that. I think it's a real unraveling of one identity that's been formed certainly since probably teenage years, and a rebuilding of another one. And for a lot of people, it's their sort of mid-career moment too. So most of my coaches, not all of them, I've got some in their 20s, but most of them are late 30s to late 40s. And it's a moment in the career where they sort of got to where they always intended they wanted to get to, or hoped they'd get to. And now they're there, they're like, is this it? Is this what I want to be doing? I'm not sure that I like this, or I'm really worried that I'm really rubbish at this, and all of that. And yet it sort of remains unspoken because obviously, on social media, everyone's crushing it and smashing it, and it's amazing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the book is really kind of a reflection of what I've experienced through my coaches and what their experiences have been, as much as my own. And then I had this idea that came from some other people actually, about writing. There's a phrase, I think it's Andy Marachek, I can't remember if that's how you say his surname, but this idea of sort of writing or working with the garage door open, and this idea of sort of writing it a bit more in public. And partly it's because it's a bit of an unspoken thing. My thesis is there's a secret market for this book, there's a lot of people are like, oh yeah, that it's not just me. I have that too, because it's kind of not what people generally go on LinkedIn and stuff, and they don't write. I feel like such an imposter. I've got no idea what I'm doing. I'm really going through a crisis. That's not what you write. But I think there is a lot of it going on. So part of it was to sort of open that up and try and get as many diverse perspectives as possible. Because obviously, I'm a straight, cis, white, middle-aged male. I mentioned before, private school education. I'm aware of all the kind of privileges that have allowed me to kind of probably have all sorts of opportunities that I don't even realise that I had. And I want to make sure that I'm getting a lot more diverse input into people's stories around that. Because I'm really interested in exploring and writing about what's that inner journey that people go through. There's a lot of tactical stuff out there about, like Peter Meerholz's book on, setting up design orgs and, stuff around setting up teams and all that kind of stuff. But I mostly in the coaching, I deal with that moment. And for people, like I said, they're late 30s to late 40s mostly. So it's mid-career, but it's also midlife. Right? Mm-hmm. There's quite a lot of people having a midlife moment where they're really like reconsidering what they want to do and if this is it. And so my coaching is coaching people through that. I wanted to write about that journey.
I think it's such an important conversation that I really do hope we actually can have that conversation in public, also on social media, because just 2 days ago, I finished a training. It's actually it was a facilitation training. So a training facilitator, and so they take turn in facilitating a session. And me and another coach, we observe, and then the participants everyone else will kind of give feedback after the session. So that's really confrontational, right? So I'm going to do this session and people are just going to give you, and we all intentionally, we kind of make it very difficult for them as well. So because we give one participant the role to kind of be someone who's either an observer or they play a role like
it's like a sort of disruptor or a naysayer and things.
Yeah, and we give them a script. So this is what you're going to do.
That's very good.
Yeah.
That's very good.
Yeah, it's very mean. But it works. Even in person, when we do an in-person session, they don't even know in the beginning who that is or that is actually happening. So you just think, who's this terrible person? We're in a training. What are you doing to me? Right? Online, that was a bit difficult. They know who it is, but it's still annoying because they had a plan and someone is just not switching on their camera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, my point is that what happens is that we have these moments where we reflect. And, every time someone in the group will say, so for instance, they get reflection from the participants. So they get feedback and people will say, you look very comfortable. It went really smooth. It was really great. And you you were in control. And then the person who did the facilitation said again, a couple of days ago, happened again, said, I was so nervous. I'm drenched from, my shirt is wet from the sweat, my fear. And people go like, oh, me too. I have that same, I'm so nervous about this. And so, it's that conversation that all of a sudden makes, you talk about this imposter syndrome, but this idea that you have to be something and everybody seems to be able to do that perfectly. And, look at social media, everyone's amazing, right? And then when someone actually says, they're not, and they are nervous and they didn't know what they were doing and they felt completely not in control, that opens up so much space for the people and the real conversation and the real growth and the real learning. And so in a way, your topic, I think that's the conversation we should have. I think that is all the other stuff you can leave. I don't care about anything else. Really, seriously, nothing matters. This matters.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I think it does. And someone said to me yesterday, actually, they said, and he's someone who's been quite senior in organizations, said, I've always I became shocked about how much of leadership or senior leadership in large organizations is performative, and I think it's a real problem. I mean, watching Succession, I don't know if you've watched Succession, but watching it makes me sort of cringe terribly because it's sometimes like it feels like a documentary. I've really seen that kind of constant sort of hedging around each other and not really saying what you mean because you're testing out to see what the other side the other person's on and all that kind of stuff. And it's not only performances; it's terribly immature. Like it's really kind of sort of school playground stuff, and I really wish for sort of more openness there. And, I can only sort of operate in the area that I know. And I definitely think, the more that people realize that, one of the things about leadership is obviously is you're making it up as you go along, and I heard years and years ago, someone once said this thing of, the disappointing thing about becoming an adult is realizing that grown-ups don't have all the answers. Right? That you have this kind of
exactly.
And it's actually incredibly freeing once you have that moment. Like, I'm just making this up. I'm not making it up out of kind of nothing. I have got 30 years of experience that I'm basing this on and patterns that I've seen and so forth. But that it's your job de facto as sort of in leadership is you're out there at the front, right? And if you're following someone else's thing, then you're not really doing that leadership role. So your job is to make it up, and to feel comfortable and okay with it takes, I think, quite a lot of inner work. That I think you have to kind of be. The phrase of authentic leadership is sort of become a bit trite, but the underlying question is, authentic to what? What are you being authentic to? And if you don't actually know, if you've kind of, because we don't do it enough. We don't spend enough time sitting down thinking, what am I really about? What are my values? What is it that I kind of stand for? What do I do? This is what I do in the coaching. It's often the first time in sort of 20 years people have actually done that. Because without that, you can't really then start to feel, okay, this is me. This is the shape of me. These are the things I do. These are the things I don't do. And then there's a confidence in that. You're never always in that zone, but it's a sort of center that you come back to. And then you feel okay by saying, I don't do that bit, or I can't do that bit, or I'm not interested in doing that bit. I'm going to do this. There's a sort of comfort in being yourself. But, being yourself is obviously, there's a massive amount of privilege in being able to do that. It's a lot easier for me than it might be for someone else. And B, though, there is a kind of huge relief and comfort in and confidence in that, because you're not trying to be something you're not.
That's really beautiful. Yeah. I think it's scary because, right, we go into the world and this is what a designer does, or this is what a leader does, or this is what an adult does. And then you realize you can just bring your whole self, and it's really scary and liberating all at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I think it's, I respect people who don't want to bring their whole self to work, because I think that it's quite all right. I mean, that's what we also have to be careful of. It's quite all right to say, no, you know what, this bit of my life doesn't belong to you. But I think it's important to be sort of aligned to yourself. To go back to to go back to the kind of performing arts. I've become really interested recently in sort of watching documentaries I watched the 2 Ed Sheeran documentaries, and there was sort of others that I've watched. There's one about, there was a David Bowie one when he died. And it's really fascinating to watch a couple of things. One is their ability to sort of become an expanded version of themselves on stage. And someone like Ed Sheeran has done a lot of work, it's clearly a lot of effort to kind of be himself, because there's a whole machine around him that wants him to be something else. But to kind of be himself on stage, and to kind of, but it's a slightly magnified version, obviously, of any performer on stage. But then when they sort of come off stage, they sort of go back to it. I mean, Tina Turner was legendary. She was quite an introvert, really. But on stage, she's Tina Turner. Right? But I think the ability to be able to switch between those roles, and you might recognise this from facilitation, that there's a sort of gig aspect of it, where you actually need to sort of take on the projection of everyone else, that, I'm the facilitator and I'm kind of running the room at the moment. The mistake is to believe that that's what you're like, all the time. And I'd argue that's probably, you said CEOs that don't get told the truth. That's sort of what goes on with people like, Elon Musk and so on, that they sort of believe that they're the smartest person in the room because no one dares tell them that they're not.
Exactly. Well, you have a stage personality. So I've done theater. So for me, what I've learned from theater is that and actually did comedy, stand-up comedy, so, which is horrible. But it taught me so much, is actually you have a stage personality.
Yeah.
And you have to get to know that person, because you have it. I mean, you can cultivate it, but it's there, and you can use it. And that's such a great thing to learn about yourself. Like, who is that person? But that can be genuine. That can be you. It can be your authentic self as well. Yeah. And I think so. As facilitators, and I think that's one of the things we have to be aware of, that there is that stage personality there, but it can be you. And so the more genuine it is, the more you can connect to it, the more human becomes more. And again, we go back to the safe space. If you pretend to be someone you're not, or you start believing in something that other people are like, no, it's like, if you have an Elon Musk as a facilitator, everybody was like, oh my God, you just go through the motions. But that idea of you are a different person on stage than off stage, that's such a really eye-opening thing for a lot of people. Like, that is different.
I think I like to think of it as a sort of magnified. And when it's good, it's like a magnified version of you. So it's not like the I don't know if you remember David Burns, from Talking Heads, the big suit. This idea that it's the same thing but kind of bigger, because the sort of audience, if you like, or the kind of situation is bigger. But then but the important thing is to not. Even if you're sort of playing another role, and I think that's actually difficult. I think that's problematic in kind of leadership, because I think it's not. You don't want to be being something you're not, but there is a sort of slightly expanded version of you, but that's not there all the time. It depends on the situation. Because if people have experienced the other thing as well, and it's not very good, where you've had someone who's supposed to be giving a kind of talk or a presentation, or supposed to be sort of, it's an all hands, and they're sort of small and apologetic, and it's like, I want you now to step up and be that person, and you're not, or you're just reading off a piece of paper, and it's. We do want that as well. We want someone to kind of step into that role and not kind of mumble through it and shy away from it and go, whatever, but that's just me. That's not leadership. But it also doesn't have to be like that all the time.
that it's I can talk about this forever, but I think yeah, we need, because of time, we need to kind of unfortunately end this podcast. Thank you so much. I'm really very inspirational. I am actually would love to kind of. I actually have the website open now, because where you say, fill in, if you want to.
Yeah, please do. Yeah,
early draft community
that's
there.
Right.
So yeah. So I think this idea of having a draft community is awesome. Love to kind of see what comes out of it. I think this is the conversation we should have, and I mean, yeah, sure, it's good to talk about design thinking and service design and all that, and and lean startup and all. And to be honest, I'm like, okay, what's next? What's now? And I think what you're doing, I think that's what should be next, specifically for the kind of the early community in service design and thinking that have kind of been evolving. I think they need this. They need this conversation, because I recognize that they are at that sort of, they're bumping into a ceiling. Maybe it's a psychological thing or whatever, but there's this thing like, how do I now grow? Yeah. And I think this is it.
I think it's important to recognize it's all about people. The more senior I got, the more I realized that I did not have design teams or anyone else coming to stakeholders, senior people, whatever it was, coming to me saying, this process isn't, is a problem, or we don't know how to design this thing. It was all this person is a problem. I'm having a struggle with this team, and these people aren't working together well. It's all, it's 95% people stuff.
Yeah,
It's we hide behind process and method and things, but actually, it's all people stuff. And the quicker you get to recognize that, I think the quicker you get to that space that you're talking about, where we can actually talk about what's going on with us and how and move things forward.
It's all people stuff.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.